Hello and welcome here again live to the World Crypto Network to the next part of this show, Read Rothbard and Use Bitcoin. And today we are joined by the one and only Stefan Kinsella. How are you doing?
I'm very well. Good to be here.
Oh, I'm really glad and really thankful that you joined this discussion here because you've really written some fantastic books and articles on intellectual property and the theory of ideas, and you've been a great influence on my life, and I've quoted you already a couple times here on the show before, so I'm really looking forward to this discussion. Thank you for joining.
Happy to do it.
So to start off, we always get off with some quotes. But first, I really want to put this out here that your book Against Intellectual Property is fantastic. It really is amazing. It really lays out what intellectual property is and why it is such a fallacious topic. And we'll get into this more into detail here. But you can get the PDF or the audiobook for free, thanks to the Mises Institute, and of course, thanks to Stefan. So yeah, thank you very much for providing it here.
It's my pleasure.
And we're just going to start off with a quote from your article that you sent me in advance called Intellectual Property and Libertarianism. Creation is an important means of increasing wealth. As Hans Hermann Hoppe has observed, one can acquire and increase wealth either through homesteading, production, or contractual exchange, or by expropriating and exploiting homesteaders, producers, and contractual exchangers. There are no other ways. While production or creation may be a means of gathering wealth, it is not an independent source of ownership or rights. Production is not creation of new matter. It is the transformation of things from one form to another. The transformation of things someone already owns, either the producer or someone else. Using your labor and creativity to transform your property into more valuable finished products gives you greater wealth, but no additional property rights. If you transform someone else's property, he owns the resulting transformed thing, even if it is no more valuable. So the idea that you own anything you create is a confused one that does not justify intellectual property. So Stefan, just a couple more words to this quote. What is it all about?
Well, intellectual property is something I've focused on over the last 25 or so years of my legal career, which I'm a patent attorney here in America, and also in terms of libertarian theory. And although it's not really, I used to say it wasn't my main interest, because I was, and I in a way still am, more interested in other aspects of libertarian theory, like the basis of rights, epistemology, ethics, Austrian economics, even history, and not that I'm an expert on that at all, but history and sociology and the other issues. But because I started trying to figure out this issue of intellectual property, because I was getting conflicting or things that seemed, conflicting ideas about it, or things that didn't make sense to me, the more I thought about it, and because I was practicing that type of law, and so I understood it. And so at first you see people make mistakes, like, just legal mistakes. They confuse trademark and copyright and patents all the time. And this happens even with some of the best libertarians who are pretty solid on the IP issue. Even they get these things confused, and I understand why. It's like not knowing the 3 or 4 different types of antitrust law in the U.S. You have the Clayton Antitrust Act and the Sherman Antitrust Act, and they're all sort of different. And you have to be a specialist to know these things. And of course, that's one problem with having a legalistic and a legislation-based legal system in the first place, right? It becomes the domain of specialists. But, you know, so I tried to clarify these things in my own mind and for others. And the more I did it, the more I realized that people were getting this thing confused. So I turned my attention to that, and with my interest in Mises and economics and property theory and libertarianism, and with my knowledge of the law and intellectual property law, I tried to sort it out. And just to get it out of the way, really. So I wrote some article back in like 2000, you know, 18, 19 years ago now. I just wanted to write one thing and get it out of the way and turn my attention back to the other things that interest me. But, you know, it's never died down because this is a perplexing issue for most people. And I found that to sort it out in your mind requires a rethinking of the basics, right? About what property is, what the purpose of law is, what rights are, interconnections between different types of law. So at the very least, getting your mind sorted on intellectual property makes you clarify your thoughts on basic libertarian issues, which I still think are in a sense more important. But anytime, you know, so I've developed like an antenna or like a red flag instinct. You know, when the hairs on the back of my neck go up, when I start hearing something, I can detect right away someone is they're misunderstanding intellectual property, or they're saying something about libertarian theory or economics that would lead to the same mistakes that led to patent and copyright law. Then I automatically start getting on the alert, right? Like if someone says that, oh, you own the fruits of your labor, I know what they mean. Usually it's reasonable. Usually it's decent-minded. Usually it's a metaphor. But that type of thinking that you own the fruits of your labor, I know where that idea comes from and where it could lead to, right? So when you say you own the fruits of your labor, that's the Lockean idea that you own your labor because you own your body, because God gave it to us. So you have this whole host of things that are all problematic, vague, non-rigorous type of statements, which could be well-intentioned and usually are, but they could be used for equivocation or to argue for the wrong things. So if you believe that you own your labor, then you could believe that, well, then you own things that you create, and therefore you own the intellectual creations that come from your mind, and so on. That leads to a whole host of mistakes. This is a little bit of a sidetrack, but not exactly, because so this is an explanation of why I'm always now alert to imprecision. I mean, even the word, I mean, I even argue with people over words like coercion and government. I'm like, well, we libertarians are not really against coercion. We're against aggression. We're not against violence. We're against the initiation of violence, right? We're against aggression, meaning that. And we're not against government. We're against the state, because government, as you know, being from Europe, the word government doesn't mean the same thing in Europe as it does in the U.S., where in the U.S. the word government is sort of synonymous with the word state. Whereas you guys talk about not having a government or forming a new government, but you don't mean when there's a new government being formed, you don't mean that there's no state. So you distinguish in your minds between the government and the state. So you have this functional distinction between what a governmental function is and what the state as an entity is. In the US, I think the distinction would be the administration, like the Trump administration. That's more equivalent to your government. But even that is part of the state. But, you know, even in the US and in Europe and most of the world, we're used to education and, say, the roads being part of the state because we're used to it. But it doesn't mean that it has to be. And so the word government is one of those words. So anyway, I'm just saying I get particular on these words like coercion and government. And even law and rights, you know, so that's just one reason I try to focus on these things. Now I forgot where we were going with all this. Get me back on track.
It really is important to figure out these nuances, and I agree with you. Once I really I'm not saying that I understand this concept, but once I really understood what it essentially is all about, you realize how many fallacies are in your everyday thinking. And I just want to point out a comment that Blake Anderson put in the chat. He says that I own the fruits of my labor, but not the obligations relating to other individuals. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, so this is like, Stefan Molyneux, for example, who is a fairly well-known libertarian-ish philosopher based in Canada, whom I know. I've heard even him use the expression that, like, he'll use the word ownership in this broad way to mean responsibility, basically. Like you own your actions. So they'll say you own your actions, but what they mean by that is if you perform an action that harms someone, you're responsible for the consequences of that action, which most libertarians believe, right? That's torts and criminal law. If you harm someone by your actions, you're responsible for it. And you could say in a loose way, that means you own that. People say that, I don't own that. But technically in legal philosophy or in just law, to own is a legal concept, meaning you have the legally recognized right to control a resource. So I would distinguish between obligations and between ownership. Or I would say this: ownership only implies basically negative obligations, the obligation to refrain from doing something, which is one reason why libertarians, or the classical libertarians, used to emphasize the difference between negative and positive rights, or negative and positive obligations. And we would say something like, well, libertarians only believe in negative obligations, not positive. And what they meant there was that you can't be on the hook. You don't have a positive obligation to provide someone with, the means of their survival or their life or food and shelter. It's basically the denial of a general welfare claim, because that would imply that everyone is each other's slave, and that leads to chaos or to, an anti-liberal society. So to me, ownership, precisely used, means the legal right to control a scarce resource. It has nothing directly to say about what your responsibility is for how you use it. And in fact, if you use the term too carelessly, then you take for granted things like the concept of strict liability, which is what a lot of libertarians seem to think is the case. And they don't analyze it in close situations, because if they did, they would realize that it doesn't really answer all the questions. So, so for example, if you have, if you own an animal like a dog, and the dog escapes and bites someone, some libertarians think, well, you're the owner, therefore you're responsible for what the dog did. But to me, that doesn't follow automatically, right? Because they're assuming that ownership means responsibility. Now, you'll have libertarians that make the kind of opposite argument against the socialist welfare-minded types, and they'll say that you can't have responsibility without ownership and things like that. They're just trying to come up with arguments for why the logic behind the welfare state doesn't work, and I think they're right. But it doesn't mean that ownership, that responsibility is an incident or accessory of ownership per se. In fact, I would say that's actually not true. I would say that what you're responsible for are your actions, not for the ownership. See, ownership gives you the permission to use something. It doesn't mean you're responsible for how that thing is used. On the other hand, if you commit an action even using things you didn't own, you're still responsible. So to me, the key criteria is the action that you engage in. So as an example, if you own a gun or a knife or a piece of wood, or and someone steals it and commits a crime using that item, I don't think you're necessarily responsible for it just because you are the legal owner of that thing. On the other hand, the criminal is responsible even though he didn't have the ownership rights to the tool that he used to commit an action. The question is, did he commit an action that did something that's prohibited? So if you distinguish now in properties, I was going to get to this. The labor concept and property is another. Most people use the word property nowadays to refer as a synonym to the particular thing that is owned. That's the subject of your property right. And I'll even see definitions. They'll say a property right is the right to control a piece of property. Like, well, when you're using the word property in the definition of the concept itself, I would say that a property right is an ownership right. So I would think property and ownership rights are like synonymous terms. It's the legally recognized right to control a scarce resource. Okay, so then the question is never, so you'll get these people, they'll say something like, well, and we can turn now to our subject, is Bitcoin property or ideas property in the intellectual property sense? So they put the question as, is it property or not? And their question is a little bit of a strange one, because that's like asking, is the ether between the stars property? The question is never, is it property? The question is there some object of dispute or disagreement or conflict between human actors, and there's a dispute over it, and we need to decide how to settle this, right? Who gets to control this thing? And when you put the question that way, the focus gets drawn to, okay, what is the thing that's in dispute? What are they physically contesting? What are they conflicting over? What is it that they both can't use at the same time? What is this thing that they're both claiming some kind of control right over or ownership of? And that narrows down the question of what the thing is and helps you define what it is. But the thing is always a thing that's something that we could manipulate and control as a means of action. That's why people fight over these things. So it's always a resource, you could call it in general, or a good, or a resource. So then the question would be, not is that property, but whose property is it? Or is this a thing? Who's the owner of this thing that we're contesting? And when you put the question that way, it often becomes clear that really the question is, whose body is it? And most of us have an answer to that. It's the person who controls that body. It's your body. So because we don't believe in slavery, right? So for example, in the case of defamation law or reputation rights, if you say, well, who owns the reputation? You have to own your reputation. But they're assuming that a reputation is a type of thing that's a freestanding existing entity that can be owned. And then the question for them is, who owns it? Same thing with a song or even a Bitcoin, things like this that are the abstract entities, the way we understand them, and they just jump right to the question, who owns it? Now, if you ask who owns a song or a poem or a novel, then people are used to associating acts of labor or work or effort or creativity with being successful in the world, because in a private law society where you can control the inputs and outputs of your efforts, you're going to profit from it. So they're used to associating, labor or work with being successful. So they might offhand say, you own the fruits of your labor. But what they really mean is you're entitled to have a freedom of action within a framework in society where you can try to make a successful life, right? You can sell things to people, you can make a successful business, and it generally would result in you being successful. It doesn't really mean that you own the fruits of your labor. What it means is you're going to reap the rewards of your efforts if you're able to privatize and internalize the costs, right? Which is part of the purpose of property rights, is to stop externalizing externalities, right? So when it comes to Bitcoin, let's just turn to Bitcoin now, because the way this all started, by the way, I'm a huge Bitcoin enthusiast and collector, you might say. I know that I'm an amateur compared to lots of people, although I think lots of the experts pretend to know more than they do, because a lot of what they claim to know is a forecast of something that's going to happen in the future. And I think the future is inherently uncertain and unpredictable, as common sense and logic shows, and Mises showed. So when you say that I know this is going to happen for sure, I think you're usually full of it. So I think a little bit of caution and humility among the prognosticators is what I admire more. And anyway, I know that I'm an amateur on this issue, but you hear people say things like, he stole this guy's Bitcoins. and they'll use the word steal loosely or metaphorically or casually. And I simply started observing, well, to steal means to take someone's property or resources that they own without their consent, and to commit a tort or a crime. And I just started thinking, is it really theft that you're describing, or is it something else, right? And so the more I thought about it, the more I concluded that, well, Bitcoin is just an entry in a ledger. It's a distributed ledger that's distributed across many people's computers around the world in a voluntary system that they agree to participate in, right? A network. So can you own a ledger entry? A ledger entry is just information, and information is always patterns that are stored on on someone's property. It's the rearranging of property. You know, a Bitcoin is just some kind of data pattern that's part of a larger data pattern, and data patterns are always ones and zeros nowadays, which are stored on some underlying substrate or medium. Has to be. I mean, I suppose you could imagine a set of laser, light waves being beamed through space, carrying pulses, right, modulated in a certain way. You could imagine that as embodying a pattern, and I guess the substrate there is the ether or whatever the space-time continuum is. But no one really stores or holds even that kind of information. It's usually stored somewhere, stored in your brain, stored on a piece of paper, stored in pits and lands on a compact disk, stored in magnetic perturbations on a hard drive, stored in semiconductor flip-flops, on a non-volatile RAM on your computer. It's stored somewhere on some physical thing that's just arranged in a certain way. So a Bitcoin is just information, and the information is always stored on someone's computer. If it's stored on your computer, you already own the computer, so you don't own the Bitcoin in addition. That'd be like saying you own your computer and you own its color, which makes no sense. And by the way, if you just owned your computer and you own the pattern there, that you're not really part of the Bitcoin network. You have to have, your pattern recognized and distributed throughout the entire ledger, which means it's stored on many people's computers. And you simply don't own their computers. So I would simply say you don't own a Bitcoin, but I was thinking in the legal sense, not in the actual control sense. So there's two meanings of the word ownership. And of course, all the Bitcoin nuts went crazy. Oh, you're criticizing Bitcoin. You're saying you can't own Bitcoin. Owning Bitcoin is better than owning your car, because your car can be taken from you by the government. The government can't take my Bitcoins away. Or, the government imposes property taxes on your house, so you don't really own your house, and they can take that away from you, but they can't take my Bitcoins away, blah, 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 blah. And they're right about all that, but that I wasn't saying that they were wrong. I was simply saying you don't own your Bitcoins. But just making that statement requires unpacking the concept of ownership, distinguishing it from control or economic control or possession of a resource, and distinguishing economic concepts from legal concepts. So economics you can think of as describing the way things are. It's called descriptive, right? Descriptive analysis. Whereas the law is normative, or it sets out rules that you should follow. So it's prescriptive. It prescribes what you should do to comply with the law or to get certain results or whatever. So all these things are important, and I do think it helps to have a better understanding of the nature of property rights in general and of Bitcoin. But I've rambled on along. Go ahead. I'll let you interrupt now.
Oh, I'm absolutely not going to interrupt your flow.
I don't mean to interrupt. Sorry.
That is amazing what you just all said, and it really is a fascinating topic. And you talk in your book quite a bit, especially here in this chapter on property and scarcity, that the fact that there can be conflict over these goods makes the property rights necessary, right? We need to coordinate who owns what. And we can only do that with a clear definition of what owning stuff means. My question would then be, because in Bitcoin, yes, it is information, right? It is a non-scarce good in that sense. But also there can be a conflict over who owns these goods, because a Bitcoin, the monetary unit, a Bitcoin, can be, if we assume that it's only it's not a multi-signature, but only controlled by one private key, right? Only this private key can have control over it. And it can only be spent once, right? There is no double spending of a Bitcoin. And therefore, I would argue there can be conflict over who can spend this UTXO. And therefore, I might argue that we need, or that therefore there is property rights arisen out of that concept.
Yeah, see, the problem I have with that is that the question is what is being fought over. And so here's one way to conceptualize it. Suppose that you own a house and you go away for vacation for a month, and while you're gone, Kevin Carson or some left libertarian moves in. Not to pick on Kevin. Someone moves in, and so when you get back, they're in your house. Now, you can't use your house anymore unless you somehow physically oust them, and so you have to do what you have to do to use physical force or self-help, or you call on your neighbors, or you call on a court. You somehow have a dispute over the use of this resource, right? And most of us would agree that you're the owner, and the current possessor can be physically forced out if he has to, and have to pay damages, etc. Now, take something that's less stable than a real property or immovable property, like a piece of land or a house or an improvement on there. Something like a watch. Let's say you have your grandfather has a watch, a very valuable sentimental watch, and someone steals it, 50 years ago, and that watch is passed around. The thief sells it to someone else, and it's sold to someone else, and eventually one day at a flea market, you see the watch, or at a pawn store, you see the watch for sale, and you have, let's assume you have inherited all your grandfather's rights. Now, you might want to claim the watch back, even though the guy owning it right now is a sort of a good faith possessor, we call it in the law. Now, the law has rules to deal with that. Usually you'd be able to get the watch back. And in purist libertarian law, you should be able to get the watch back, even though there was an intermediate person who owned it, right? Who was an innocent, good faith purchaser. Because you own the actual watch, you never parted with ownership of it. Which means that you could get an order from a court saying to the current possessor, you have to turn the watch over. Okay, so that's the result of this line of thinking. Now, what would it mean to own Bitcoin? It would mean that if someone somehow steals your Bitcoin, and you can imagine a house being trespassed against, or someone squatting in your house or stolen. You could imagine a watch being stolen. You could imagine a cow being stolen, or an apple, apples from a tree, or even gold coins. You could imagine all that being stolen. You could even imagine people being stolen, right? Enslaved or killed. But if we imagine a Bitcoin being stolen, which is just thrown out there, by the way, without giving the context of what exact scenario do you mean by being stolen? Like when the FBI or whoever it was seized the Silk Road's coins, yeah, I guess you could call that stolen, but we already know the government is a coercive agency, and they basically trespassed against the physical property of whoever was in control of Silk Road servers to do that. So it's not so clear they just stole the Bitcoins out of thin air. It was just a consequence of their stealing his computers or something like that. So, but let's imagine a Bitcoin is stolen. So let's say 10 Bitcoins are stolen from some guy. Now he goes to court, and let's say the guy that stole it from him has already spent those 10 Bitcoins, so they're in someone else's hands now. They're in a third party's hands, like the watch might be in a third party's hands. And you could get the watch. Let's assume you could get the watch back, or the stolen bicycle, or some movable object. What's your remedy for the stolen Bitcoins? The 10 Bitcoins, you can trace them. They're in 50 different people's hands now. can you get an order from the court for them to turn the Bitcoins back over to you? Or can you get an order from the court telling all 50,000 users around the world who have nodes or that are miners, can you tell them you have to adopt this patch to the software to recognize this rewinding, in a sense, right, of this transfer, and give the current holders Bitcoins back to the original victim of the theft? Well, if the court had the authority to do that, they would have to basically have ownership of the computers of all these people that are participating in the network, and I don't think they have that right. The people that have just a copy of the current ledger on their computers. They don't have any obligation to shift that ledger to represent the the restitutive reality that people want to impose on them. And because that's not conceivable in a just way, my conclusion is that you can't own the Bitcoins, because if ownership doesn't mean that you can order people to undo the situation, it means nothing at all.
Okay,
right?
great points that you bring up here. And maybe in addition to the term stealing Bitcoin, there are consensus rules, right? They were set on the January 3rd, 2009 by Satoshi himself, and there's continuously to this day being operated from by everyone's full node, right? And a part of this consensus rule was a rule set on how to spend Bitcoin. And in order to do that, you need to create a transaction that had an equal amount of outputs and inputs, so no additional Bitcoin were created. But then more importantly, they have to have a valid signature that links to these unspent transaction outputs that are the new inputs of this new transaction. And you could say that in this rule set of Bitcoin, in the law of Bitcoin, in the consensus code of Bitcoin, it clearly says that as soon or as long as you have a correct and valid signature to this transaction, it is a valid Bitcoin transaction. And even though that a malicious hacker might somehow get control over your private key, if he has a valid signature of that private key that will send the funds to his own personally controlled wallet, well, then he has not stolen Bitcoin from you, because he has played perfectly fine by the rules. There is no arbitrary way of making a valid Bitcoin transaction invalid, because it is valid. And there we clearly see that it doesn't really matter which real person has access to these Bitcoin. As long as the rules were upheld by the consensus rules, as long as there's a valid signature, it is a valid transaction. And therefore, no court whatsoever can make it invalid and remove it from the blockchain.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And I think that's actually an important point, because one of the arguments people use is that they'll say that stealing someone's Bitcoin, and again, they never specify the conditions of what the theft is, because it makes a difference. If you break into someone's home and you steal their laptop and you get their codes that way, and you're able to take their Bitcoins that way, then you've committed an act of trespass already, right? Which is already illegal and should be illegal. If you break a non-disclosure or confidentiality agreement, and like you're an employee, again, you're in violation of contract rights. It's hard to imagine any kind of so-called theft that is within the rules of Bitcoin that actually works to transfer Bitcoins from one account to the other. That is not also a separate act of crime that's already covered by libertarian theory and regular tort law, like it's a type of trespass or contract breach, or if you hold a gun to someone's head and you coerce them to give you their code, then you're committing a crime against them. The only way you could imagine that would be if someone just somehow guessed, or somehow spied your key. So like if you're careless and you leave your private key on a big piece of paper in your living room, and someone can see it with a telescope through your windows from across the street, I don't know if they've really violated your rights. I mean, they haven't violated the rules of Bitcoin if they use that key to take the coins. They haven't committed trespass. They haven't committed fraud. They haven't committed breach of contract. They haven't even lied, because you don't even have to pretend like you have some legal right to this code to participate in the network. You can even be anonymous, right, to be on the network. So the only way you could imagine it would be some kind of other type of coercion, which means that saying Bitcoin is theft, talking about Bitcoin theft is just a confusion with other types of offenses that are already wrongs. And if you guess someone's key, well, then that means that the encryption relied upon by the network is not sufficient. But as far as we can tell, it's more than sufficient for any conceivable future and any conceivable computer systems that could even, guess your code or hack into your code, your private key. And if it wasn't, then the network would collapse, or maybe another one would evolve, or it would evolve better protections. But the point is, right now, people rely upon the technology and the way the system is designed for practical protection. As long as you keep your code, your secret key, your private key private, it's virtually impossible for someone to take the only way someone to do it is for you to be careless, or for you to have your rights violated in other ways, like contract breach or trespass. It seems to me, this is how it seems to me, being not the greatest expert on the technology of Bitcoin.
Oh, fantastic points. And that just shows how beautiful Bitcoin is, right? Because, with the internet, we have this network of non-scarce goods, of information that is shared freely and openly across millions and billions of nodes. And, on top of this non-scarce network, where at barely any marginal cost, you can send and copy information openly and freely, we now have created on top a system with Bitcoin that is scarce. In the sense that there are only 21 million, and once I send my Bitcoin to someone else, they're gone. I no longer have them, and I no longer have control over them. But it is not fully scarce, right? Because even these access codes, even this password to the Bitcoin, in order to follow consensus rules, in order to sign the transaction, the password itself is a non-scarce good. It's words, it's ones and zeros, right? There is no ownership in that aspect. But I can use this non-scarce information to control scarce units of this non-tangible good, which is called Bitcoin.
What's interesting about that is, in another sense, the entire Bitcoin ledger, right, the entire blockchain and the code is open source, and anyone can copy it, and they do, right? This is what a lot of the altcoins are. It's basically a copy of the whole thing. There's nothing preventing you from copying the entire ledger right now. It's just that if you don't participate with a given particular network that's using this ledger, you're not going to be able to influence any transfers or transactions within it. But you could start your own. It would be like having the ability to take the entire universe or the entire Earth and make a copy of it, but then you wouldn't be able to use it because it would be sterile, right? Or maybe it would work. Maybe it would thrive on its own in another universe. And in fact, if someone could walk up to your home or to your bicycle or your car and they could make a copy, I don't think people would mind so much, right? Because the reason I care that someone takes my car is because I don't have it anymore when they take it. But if they just looked at it and could make a copy in their own country and use it for their own uses, it wouldn't bother me so much. And this shows in a way that the lack of analogy between things that are informational in character and things that are material or scarce in nature. The reason we have these concepts of theft and trespass and conflict is because of the reality of the material world. And when we try to transport these concepts like theft to the digital realm, we sometimes run into to mistakes in our analysis. I think the reason we do it is because in an economic concept, we're worried about prosperity and getting what we want, and we're worried about exchange. So for example, if in a primitive society or in a simpler society, you could imagine people having material things like sheepskin, or a spear, or a rock that's sharp, or an apple, or a sheep, or a shoe, or whatever, and they physically exchange it, then both the participants are better off after the exchange. Well, this could be a purely economic exchange. The law doesn't even have to really recognize it. It's just an exchange. And we see why people start exchanging, because of the division of labor and specialization of labor, and because of the market economy, and because of the nature of trade itself, right? And exchange makes both parties better off. So we start legalizing this, and we recognize in law property ownership in a more institutional way, and then the ability of these owners to exchange and have that exchange recognized by the legal system. And that just enhances this economic ability to exchange. So we get used to these concepts like exchange, which is a root of what makes us wealthier, what makes our lives better, and what makes us more able to achieve our goals. And then we start thinking, well, in a more sophisticated economy where we're more and more separated from what we do, right? Like, this is sort of the Marxian idea of the criticism of capitalism, is that you're separated from the results of your labor and you get alienated and all these kinds of things. But in a huge economy like we have now, 7 billion people in the world trading with each other in effect all the time, you don't always know directly the results of what's going on. And so you start impersonalizing these forces, and you start thinking of anything that you do that gets you some kind of value that you want, and you call it an exchange because it's an interaction with another person. Like if I pay someone for a shoe shine, if I give a girl a smile and she waits on my table in a slightly better way. There's all these impersonal things. We think of them economically as exchanges, but because we're so used to exchanges being tied up with property rights and ownership, that we think of them in a legalistic way. And that's not always proper. It's not always appropriate. Law doesn't have to be everything, and maybe law is just an intermediate phase of human history. Maybe that you come out of barter and physical exchange and physical interaction and a crude legal system, and the legal system gets more sophisticated. But maybe in the future, the legal system becomes atrophied and is less necessary because it becomes impossible to steal. Like if 99% of your wealth is tied up in intangible or immaterial goods, that it's impossible for someone to so-called steal because of the private key encryption system, then law would become less necessary. It would be harder for people to harm each other. These are all science fictional, futuristic ideas, but it's fun to think about, and so what?
Exactly. It's amazing fun to think about all of this stuff. And I agree with you that in Bitcoin, you no longer need this classical law, right? You no longer need to appeal to a court in order to get your Bitcoin back. No, you defend your Bitcoin and nobody can take them away. And then you don't even need to go to the judge and ask for your Bitcoin back. And maybe then to elaborate a bit further on this, and this builds up again on what you said in your book, that the fact that there can be conflict over these goods by multiple human actors, and that is the point that I want to focus on right now, because Bitcoin is programmable internet money, right? It's magical internet money, and yes, you can have a UTXO, a unspent transaction output, that is corresponding to only one public or private key. And that means that only with the knowledge of this one password, you can control this UTXO and reassign it on the ledger. But of course, in Bitcoin, there's also stuff like multi-signature addresses, where you do not only need control over one set of private key, but you need several of them. Let's say 2 out of 3. And that means now that there are several human actors involved that have control over this good, which is a Bitcoin. And my question to you would be, can there be now conflict? And does this aspect of having several people controlling this Bitcoin fundamentally change the concept?
Well, so the way I would look at it is that whatever scheme and by scheme, I don't mean a scam, I just mean a schema or a system. Whatever private system people enter into, and they're aware of the nature of that system. You know, it's like playing a game of Monopoly or something like that with people, where the rules are laid out and there's only certain people that can participate. When you're aware of what's going to happen to these so-called goods, it seems hard to imagine that you have a complaint. And I would imagine that, in a sense, the entire Bitcoin system, I mean, it doesn't make any sense to have money with one person or at all, or Bitcoin or a network. It only makes sense in a multi-person society in the first place. And even Bitcoin itself has a certain consensus mechanism for recognizing certain transfers, right? Certain transactions. So you're always dependent upon some kind of external consensus for anything happening with your so-called goods. And that's just part of the rules of the game that you've agreed to play. I don't like to call it a game, because game theorists use that term in a derogatory way, but I think it doesn't have to be derogatory. It is a game in a sense. Now, as for conflict, I think conflict literally has to mean ultimately some kind of physical, potentially violent clashing of humans with their physical bodies with each other over something that's a type of thing they could clash over. Just because only within a scheme, a private scheme, only a certain number of people or one person could have control over one of the so-called Bitcoins or spaces within that system, is a different sense of the word conflict, I would say. Because, again, to have real conflict, it has to be over a physical resource. And they're not really fighting over who controls the hard drives or the servers of all the other people on the network. Those people have the right to control that already. But what you could imagine is a group of people that voluntarily came together to do this, and among themselves, they have a private contract. This is similar to corporate law, right? Where corporate law, there are corporate assets or resources like the money or the capital or the factories. I mean, take the Google jet, for example. The Google jet, people would say that theoretically the jet, you know, the big 747 owned by Google, is theoretically owned by the company, but the company is owned by the shareholders. So I guess they would have to say that every shareholder of Google is a partial owner of the jet. And you can say that as a legalistic matter, but does that mean that you can go use the jet? No. Does it mean that a Google shareholder can go into the Google headquarters without getting permission? No. So ownership is diffused and spread out, and it's ownership among those people by an agreement between them that the rest of the world agrees to recognize and see them as a single entity, right? So a simple example would be a husband and wife owning a house. To the rest of the world, they co-own that together. Between themselves, they have to work it out, and they have, you know, a marital agreement between them. But if they have a dispute, they have to go by that internal agreement. And if they can't work it out, they have to dissolve the whole thing, and then they go by the pre-existing rules to split the assets up. And at that point in time, when they split the assets up, then the rest of the world would recognize that. So in the case of this co-ownership of Bitcoins that you're describing, that's how I would look at it, a co-control of Bitcoins. But everyone as part of that regime agreed to it ahead of time. So I don't see it as a conflict. I think it would just be a case where people are unhappy with the arrangement that they previously agreed to enter into, and if they don't like it, they have to dissolve it according to the ways out that they also agreed to.
Oh, exactly. Perfect. Absolutely. I agree with all what you just said. And, you know, the act of doing a Bitcoin transaction necessarily implies that you do it voluntarily, right? Because, at least according to consensus rules, because you have provided your private key, you have provided the signature. And according to the rules, that's it. And you have agreed to these rules with you buying Bitcoin, right? With you going out there and running a Bitcoin full node. your act of doing that showcases consent in all these rules. And of course, we've established that Bitcoin is a protocol and therefore speech, and therefore nobody owns it. But now the interesting question is, who controls it? And we've seen that with stuff like the Bitcoin Cash hard fork or the user activated soft fork and all that stuff. And that's interesting Bitcoin history. But fundamentally, I would say, well, first of all, my Raspberry Pi, this physical box, I own it, right?
Yeah.
I exchange for it. I own this physical good. It's a scarce good. Only one person has full control and ownership over it. It's mine, right? But then, of course, the software, that's where it gets tricky. Because fundamentally, it's just bits, right? It's ones and zeros, again, speech. Therefore, nobody really owns it. And you earlier talked a little bit about the aspect of it being open source. So although I might not own it, I have full control over it because I see every single bit in the software. I could theoretically, if I have these skills, change any line of code at whim, and nobody could stop me. And because I do not have to trust anyone else but my full node, my fully validating and authoritatively validating node, does this mean that I, as a full Bitcoin user, have full control over Bitcoin?
Well, I think you know the answer. I think the answer is no, because you're part of a network, and you have to. You can't just change the entire. You could make a copy. You could change it, but if you don't follow the rules, others aren't going to recognize it. And by the way, the open source thing. If it wasn't open source, the only way it could not be open source is if there was copyright law that prevented that. But of course, this is why there's an interaction between intellectual property law and what I'm talking about here. The only way it would not be open source is if there was copyright law, which is completely invalid because, again, software is just code and information and should not be ownable. It is ownable under copyright law, but it should not be. It's an invalid law. So the only way you could say that you don't really own your piece of hardware in front of you is because it's got on it a piece of software which is owned by someone else, whoever the copyright authors of that program are. So it's a good thing that they made it open source under the copyright rules. I don't think that I doubt that such a project could work or get off the ground if everyone didn't agree to release it from the clutches of copyright law. But in a free society, there wouldn't be copyright law anyway, and everything would be open source. No software would ever be ownable at all. And also, this brings to mind something, I didn't send you these links, but you're probably aware of some of these things. Different countries around the world, different governments, different tax agencies, and the like, have split, as far as I know, on the issue of the legal status of Bitcoins. Some say that cryptocurrency is what they call property, and some say it's not. And then there's a question about whether it's currency or not, whether it. But the people that balk at the idea that Bitcoin is not property, like I say, or it's not ownable, should be a little bit careful about what they wish for, because when the government calls it property, now that means it's subject to capital gains taxes and all kinds of regulations and rules by the state. We might be better off if the government played stupid and acted like they didn't know what to do with it and just treated it like information that was not ownable. Because having the government recognize something as property is not necessarily something that we Bitcoiners want.
Oh, yes, absolutely. You just blew my mind with this one. Yes, that is fundamentally true. And as soon as they put this property label on it, as soon as they say this is something that we can control, of course, it's hubris because they cannot control it, but it sets the precedence of them at least trying to.
Well, I mean, I think Ross Ulbricht is in jail right now for Silk Road activities, and partly because of the use of Bitcoin, right? And I'll give you another thing, slightly off topic, but something I've blogged about before. I think Tom Bell made this point, who's another libertarian law professor, and it's the idea that when you start calling copyright and patent, right, which are government granted monopoly privileges on information, when you call that property, which the government does by labeling it intellectual property. Okay, so so over time, to sell this idea that we should have laws that protect rights to information by calling it intellectual property, and by making over and over and over again the strained argument that it's a type of property, it's just a different type, it's intellectual property. When they keep calling it a type of property, then eventually that turns around, and what you'll have is you'll have some like welfare status type or mainstream type legal theorists, or people that want the government to be able to control regular property like your house or your car or your body. They'll say, well, your right to intellectual property is not absolute, because the government can give you a compulsory license, or it only lasts for 70 years or 17 years or whatever. And that's a type of property. So we should import the rules that the government uses to regulate intellectual property and import them back onto other types of property. After all, they're all types of property. It's crazy. So basically, they make a strained argument to justify an intrusion on property rights by calling it a type of property right, and it's heavily regulated because it's an artificial creation of the state and legislation. And then they turn around eventually and say, well, we should regulate regular property in a similar way. So if you get taxed on you have a property tax on your home, you can't complain, because after all, patent rights aren't open-ended. In fact, the government can take those away after 17 years or whatever. So it's like, wait a second. So you got to be careful extending the concept of property to things beyond the material, scarce, tangible world, because it can bite us.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And quite interesting. I never thought about the implications of Bitcoin ultimately not being property, not being ownable. And those are far-reaching consequences. Really interesting stuff. I really need to do some more thinking on that. So, Stefan, thank you so much for joining us. And I know that you have to get going. So maybe as an exit question, is there something that we've not yet touched upon, and something in regard of ownership and control of Bitcoin?
Well, I mean, I'm a student of all this, and I watch your network, and I watch a lot of the shows, and I'm always personally fascinated by the debates among the Bitcoin maxers, and the ones that doubt the altcoins and Bitcoin Cash and things like that. Personally, I lean towards the Bitcoin maximalist side. I lean, but the one is Ethereum and the idea of smart contracts, right? The idea of using these systems or these mechanisms to somehow automate what people call smart contracts. And I'm personally very skeptical of that, but then I'm skeptical of artificial intelligence and of automating things in general, just because I'm just pessimistic minded. I don't see how cars can drive without AI, because there's just too many. Unless all cars are robot or automated cars, if there's just a few humans driving, then the other cars are not going to know what to do. But anyway, so I'm fascinated in seeing exactly whether the very idea of smart contracts even makes sense beyond the bare minimum of even Bitcoin, right? Even Bitcoin is a smart contract thing in a sense, because it's got an automated transfer of the ledger entries, right, according to these rules. But beyond that kind of bare thing, I'm skeptical of this whole idea of using the utility of having smart contracts. So I'm open-minded towards that. I'm trying to understand it, but everyone that I talk to seems to either, when they try to justify it or explain it, they either misdescribe property or contract law itself, or they're too utopian, or they're too optimistic, I think, in what they're saying. So I'm watching that. I'm not quite clear on exactly how this smart contract thing is going to work. So I've got my eyes open towards that. But other than that, I've got nothing left to add.
Oh, yes, that's really interesting, the concept of smart contracts. And specifically, I think there's this one inherent flaw in all types of smart contracts, is that, of course, they are black swan events, right? There are things that you simply cannot predict. And there is a really, really slim chance of them happening. But if one of these black swan events would happen, the consequences would be immense. And the whole thing with smart contracts is you need to set them up in advance, right? You need to think about all possible outcomes. And especially with a Turing complete scripting language, there are unlimited outcomes. There are unlimited things that could happen.
Well, right. And so this is, as an attorney who's done a lot of contracts, this is how lawyers think. And we think, number one, everyone knows that no contract can ever be complete. Now, this is not even a matter of computer science but it's probably true as a matter of philosophy and computer science. But as a matter of law, it's just a fact that you can never design a document that takes into account every possible occurrence. It would be too expensive to do it, and it's just impossible. I mean, that's why constitutions fail. That's why so you have to have a mechanism for deciding the issue when something happens that wasn't anticipated. That's one problem. And to my mind, that takes human intelligence and human judgment to do. So I don't see how that can be automated, number one. Maybe it can be made more cheaper. Maybe some arbitration system could make it cheaper or more, but to make it completely automated, I don't see how that's possible without artificial intelligence, and I'm a skeptic of that. And then the other issue is, to make it automated, you need to have these judgments automated, but not everything is a purely monetary contract where both parties can deposit ahead of time a sufficient amount of funds to some escrow agent that could automatically release it. Because a lot of times there's a loan aspect to a contract. Basically, someone is borrowing money from someone else in one way or the other because they don't have it yet, because they need the funds to engage in some project. So there's no way they could put the money. There's no way they could put the money aside ahead of time. And the retort to that would be, well, you could just use insurance. But I'm an Austrian, and for the same reason, I think that retort doesn't work to save fractional reserve banking, which I also think is an impossibility. You cannot insure uninsurable things. You can't insure business success. There's too much of a moral hazard, and there's other aspects to it. So there's just no way you can do it. If you could insure it, then it would take the role of the entrepreneur out of things, and the insurance company would be really making the decisions, and that just pushes it up the chain one degree. So I just don't see how you could have contracts automated either in the drafting sense, or taking into account every contingency, or having some automated decision maker that everyone's going to be happy with, or having the funds able to be paid. Sometimes the other side can't pay you, and that's why sometimes some of us have insurance on our own activities from our own insurance companies that will pay us if we get into a dispute with someone who is themselves underinsured. So there's a whole complicated thing there. The technology behind it, the vision behind it is fascinating and appealing to me. But the practicality of it, being a lawyer who's been doing this for 25 plus years in the modern era, and I've seen how slow the legal system is to adopt even form contracts, right? I mean, everyone does everything by hand, and it's very slow and I just don't see how this is just going to all of a sudden replace the lawyers, but we'll see.
Oh yes, Stefan, thank you so much for joining here on the World Crypto Network. The conversation was amazing. I for sure learned a lot. I hope you, the audience, did as well. So again, thank you so much for joining. I just want to put this out here real quick. Free Ross, goddammit. No victim, no crime. This is a human tragedy, and we need to get Ross out of there. But that's just as a side note. I need to do much more talking about that in a longer form. Guys, as you know, I'm currently writing my bachelor thesis, or part of my bachelor thesis, on anarchy and money. And one big part here is the scarce and non-scarce goods. Currently have 5 pages up with that so far. And of course, it was already heavily influenced by Stefan's amazing book Against Intellectual Property. But now that I've talked to Stefan about this in regards to Bitcoin, I really need to change some stuff in here. So I'm really looking forward to re-listening to this show, and really making sure that that I hone these words and that they make sense. So I'm really looking forward to that. Guys, you can you cannot give me the ownership over your Bitcoin, but at least you can pass on the control over from your Bitcoin to me. Guys, if you want to support the Purism fundraiser, where we of course will get the open source hardware and software laptop from Purism to do an in-depth review, right here is the possibility with Magic Internet Money. I further suggest you reading this amazing Facebook post by Stefan that he posted on January 16, link in the description, where he goes more into depth of ownership in Bitcoin. So this is really fantastic. It's a bit longer, so I'm not going to read it here, but it is absolutely worth reading. Guys, that has been it so far here on the World Crypto Network. It's been a fantastic show, and I hope you got some value out of that. Stefan, thank you again for joining us. And where can the people find out more about you?
I just say just go to stephankinsella.com, STEPHAN Kinsella.com, and for the intellectual property related stuff, it's on a linked site, c4sif.org, which is Center for the Study of Innovative Freedom.org.
Oh, that is amazing. So guys, here, the stephankinsella.com, Austro-anarchist, libertarian, legal theory. What else would you want? Come on. If you guys enjoyed this conversation, then I'm sure that you will even more enjoy all the other stuff that Stefan has put out there. So go out there, read his book, read his blog post. You'll absolutely get some value out of that. I very much enjoyed this discussion, and I will see you guys on the next one. Bye-bye.